Before he was the Nameless King, he was the heir to the sun itself, the firstborn of Gwyn, the god of war, the architect of the Dragonslayers. And then, in a single act of betrayal, his name was torn from every record, his statues shattered, his legacy erased. But you cannot erase the storm. This is the complete story of the god who chose the dragons over his father and paid the ultimate price. Make sure you subscribe. Now let's begin. The origins of the being, now known only as the Nameless King, are rooted in the primordial fog of the Age of Ancients, an era that existed before the concept of time was even established by the advent of the first flame. This was a world of grey crags, archtrees, and everlasting dragons. Into this stagnant reality, the firstborn of Gwyn was born, appearing as the primary heir to the sunlight and the cornerstone of a new hierarchy. As the eldest son of the Lord of Cinder, his birth was the most significant event in the early history of the gods, signaling the start of a biological and spiritual dynasty that would eventually tear the world away from the ancients. He was not a prince of shadows or illusions like his younger brother, but a literal manifestation of the sun's raw power. From the moment of his birth, the firstborn was gifted with the power of the storm. This was not a learned skill or a miracle gifted by a temple. It was an innate, atmospheric capability that allowed him to channel devastating lightning through his very veins. He was the direct successor to the deific throne of Anor Londo, the city of the gods that would eventually rise to dominate the landscape of Lordran. In those early years, he was the personification of his father's ambition. Gwyn viewed his son as the perfect vessel to maintain the Age of Fire, a warrior who possessed the strength to enforce the new order and the charisma to lead the nascent armies of the gods. He was the sun itself in human form, a deific figure whose presence alone was enough to push back the grey fog of the dragons. The deific nature of the firstborn was established through his unique connection to the soul of Gwyn. While the other lords claimed their souls from the fire, the firstborn was the first to demonstrate how that power could be inherited and amplified through a bloodline. He was raised in the high halls of the royal palace, surrounded by the finest armor and weapons the smiths of the gods could forge. His education was not one of books and philosophy, but of strikes, parries, and the channeling of solar energy. He was a creature of the fire, born into a reality that was being forcibly shaped by the discovery of the Lord's souls. To the early human populations, he was the guarantee of a light that would never fade, a prince who would lead them out of the shadows of the archtrees and into a golden age of prosperity. The tactical importance of the firstborn during the transition from the Age of Ancients cannot be overstated. He was the one who oversaw the early military expeditions into the deep fog, auditing the defenses of the dragons and identifying the specific cracks in their stone scales. He was a general in training, working alongside the early Silver Knights to develop the standardized combat protocols that would eventually define the military culture of Anor Londo. He was the crown jewel of the deific era, a figure of such immense importance that the idea of him ever being erased from history was unthinkable. He was the heir to the lightning, and at this point in history, his name was the most celebrated word in the world state. His childhood was spent in the company of his father and his sister Guinevere, forming a royal trinity that represented the peak of the god's influence. While Guinevere represented the fertility and the warmth of the sun, the firstborn represented its harsh, unforgiving light. He was the enforcer of the sunlight, the one who took the miracles of his father and turned them into lethal tools of war. He was the first to hold the sunlight blade, a miracle that would later become a sacred relic of the Sunlight Covenant. His birth was the dawn of the deific era, a moment where the gods declared that the reign of the ancient dragons was reaching its terminal phase. He was the prince of the storm, and the storm was coming for the everlasting. In the early days of Lothric, the firstborn was worshipped by humans and gods alike as the original god of war. This was his primary deific function, a role that emphasized the martial superiority of the gods over the feral and unchanging nature of the ancient world. Unlike the later gods, who would hide behind illusions and shadows, the firstborn was a physical powerhouse who valued the mastery of arms above all other deific pursuits. He believed that the worth of a warrior's soul was not found in prayer or submission, but in the heat of battle and the absolute mastery of the spear. His philosophy was one of martial purity, a refusal to engage in the political gaslighting that would later define the halls of Anor Londo after his departure. The worship of the god of war was widespread among the early human settlements that served the deific throne. These warriors saw in the firstborn a figure of relatable and attainable strength. He was not a remote or distant deity. He was a commander who led from the front lines, his golden armor shimmering like the sun as he charged into the thickest of the fighting. His followers believed that by perfecting their combat skills and their armor, they were performing a sacred audit of their own potential. He taught them that the biohazard of the ancients, the dragons, could only be defeated through a combination of divine lightning and human grit. This created a strong cultural link between the god of war and the warrior class, a bond of brotherhood that would survive for eons. The firstborn's respect for arms and nothing else was a source of tension within the deific family. While Gwyn and the other lords utilized their powers to build systems of religious control, the firstborn remained focused on the tactical reality of the battlefield. He saw the world in terms of strikes and lethal openings. This made him the favorite of the elite knights of the palace, who viewed him as the ultimate authority on the art of the kill. He oversaw the training of the Silver Knights and the Royal Guardians, ensuring that every soldier in Anor Londo was a master of the sunlight arts. His influence was the reason the city remained impregnable for centuries, a fortress guarded by the greatest tactical mind of the Age of Gods. As the god of war, he was the primary dispenser of the miracles of the sun. He rewarded his most faithful and disciplined warriors with the lightning spear, allowing them to channel a fraction of his own deific power. This was not a gift of charity, but a tactical deployment of assets. He wanted a world of warriors who could protect the fire without the need for constant intervention from the gods. This proactive approach to defense made him the most effective administrator of the military might of Gwyn. He was the god of the front lines, a being who found his true purpose in the dust and blood of the battlefield rather than the gold and silk of the throne room. The philosophy of the god of war was built on the concept of the warrior's worth. He taught his followers that the gods were not superior because of their birth alone, but because of their discipline and their bravery. This meritocratic view of divinity was a radical departure from the traditional hierarchy. It made the firstborn a hero to the common soldiers, who felt that they could achieve a level of greatness through their own actions. He was a god who respected the struggle of the mortal warrior, providing them with the tools and the motivation they needed to succeed in the long war against the dragons. He was the leader who knew the name of every knight in his vanguard, a king who fought alongside his people in the grey fog. During the Great War against the ancient dragons, the firstborn transitioned from a prince into the primary architect of the military strategy of the gods. He realized early on that the traditional swords and shields of the gods were insufficient to pierce the stone scales of the ancients, which provided the dragons with a form of biological immortality. To correct this tactical failure, he designed the first Dragonslayer sword spears. These were monstrous, cross-shaped weapons that combined the reach of a spear with the crushing weight of a sword. They were specifically engineered to find the cracks in the armor of a dragon and deliver a concentrated burst of sunlight lightning directly into their core. The sword spear was a physical manifestation of the tactical genius of the firstborn. The design of the sword spear was a revolutionary moment in the history of Lordran. It allowed the Silver Knights and the elite Dragonslayers to engage the ancients on equal footing, providing them with a weapon that could penetrate the most resilient stone hides. The firstborn personally oversaw the forging of these weapons in the royal armories, auditing the quality of the titanite and the purity of the lightning infusions. He taught his knights that the sword spear was an extension of their own soul, a weapon that required absolute discipline and strength to master. This created a new class of elite warriors known as the Dragonslayers, who were the primary enforcement arm of the Age of Fire. The personal fighting style of the firstborn became the blueprint for all elite combat in Anor Londo. He utilized a combination of wide, sweeping strikes and lightning-fast thrusts that emphasized mobility and power. He was a master of the mid-range, utilizing the reach of the sword spear to keep his enemies at a distance before closing in for a terminal strike. This tactical approach was adopted by every knight who sought to serve the sunlight, creating a standardized military culture based on the actions of the firstborn. He was the one who taught them how to time their lightning bolts and how to use their shields to deflect the dragon's fire. He was the original commander, a man whose every movement was studied by the soldiers of the fire. The sword spear also served as a symbol of the status of the firstborn as the heir to the sunlight. The cross shape of the weapon was a direct reference to the rays of the sun, and the weapon itself hummed with a constant deific energy. It was a weapon of the gods, a high-tier asset that could only be wielded by those with a powerful enough soul. By designing and wielding this weapon, the firstborn was declaring his intention to be the final judge of the ancient world. To the dragons, the sword spear was the site of their own extinction, a weapon of light that could cut through the fog of immortality. He was the man who would tear down the arch trees and build the new world on the bones of his enemies. The irony of the sword spear is that it would eventually become the weapon the Nameless King used to protect the very creatures he once hunted. When he allied himself with the dragons, he did not discard his signature weapon. Instead, he refined it, integrating the power of the Stormdrake into its design. The Dragonslayer sword spear became a tool of kinship rather than a tool of genocide. It is the weapon we find at Archdragon Peak in the terminal state of the world, a relic of the Age of Gods that has survived the fall of every major empire. The sword spear is the physical record of the journey of the firstborn, from the architect of destruction to the protector of the ancients, carrying the weight of eons of war. One of the most profound relationships in the deific archives is the bond between the Nameless King and his primary pupil, Dragonslayer Ornstein. As the captain of the 4 Knights of Gwyn, Ornstein was the personification of the martial philosophy of the firstborn. He was the first knight of the sun's eldest born, a man whose entire identity was built on the foundation of the teachings of his master. The lion-themed golden armor of Ornstein and his use of lightning-infused thrusts were a direct homage to the god of war. The Nameless King was not just a commander to Ornstein. He was a mentor and a comrade in arms. They fought side by side on the front lines of the Dragon War, a high-tier tactical duo feared by every ancient creature. The bond between the two was based on mutual respect and shared experience in the heart of the battlefield. Ornstein viewed the firstborn as the ultimate authority on combat and honor, following him into the most dangerous archtrees without hesitation. The Nameless King, in turn, saw in Ornstein a warrior of immense potential, a man who could lead the Dragonslayers long after the gods had achieved their victory. He personally trained Ornstein in the art of the cross-spear, teaching him how to utilize the weight of the weapon to pin a dragon to the ground while delivering a lethal lightning strike. This mentorship was the reason Ornstein became the legendary figure known throughout history. The reality of this relationship is seen in the equipment Ornstein left behind. The Leo ring, which emphasizes the strength of thrusting attacks, is a direct reflection of the tactical influence of the firstborn. The fighting style of Ornstein was a more agile version of his master's, a speed-based adaptation that allowed him to strike the dragons in their most vulnerable spots. For centuries, Ornstein guarded the empty cathedral of Anor Londo, maintaining the illusion of deific power while he searched for any clue regarding the whereabouts of his master. He was the most loyal servant of the firstborn, a man who refused to accept the redaction of the name of his mentor. His journey to find the Nameless King is a terminal story of loyalty. When the Nameless King was exiled and his name was erased, Ornstein was forced into a state of moral and professional conflict. He was serving a family that had effectively murdered the identity of the man he respected most. This internal audit of his loyalty eventually led him to abandon his post in Anor Londo. He discarded his golden armor and his legendary spear at the gates of the arena of the Nameless King at Archdragon Peak, suggesting that he finally reached his master and chose to surrender his own identity to join him in the clouds. Whether he fell in battle against the king or was accepted as a brother once again, the presence of his gear at the peak is the definitive proof of their eternal connection. Ornstein represents the ultimate legacy of the mentorship of the Nameless King. He proved that the teachings of the God of War could survive even the total erasure of the teacher from the annals of history. The Nameless King was a mentor who didn't just teach his pupils how to kill. He taught them how to find their own conviction. The decision of Ornstein to seek out his master is a requiem for the bond between soldiers, a reminder that the only thing more powerful than a god is the loyalty of a knight who refuses to forget the truth. The lion and the sun are forever linked. Two warriors who chose the reality of the storm over the illusion of the sunlight. To ensure that the spirit of martial cooperation survived the inevitable decay of the Age of Fire, the firstborn founded the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant. This was his most enduring institutional contribution, a group of knights dedicated to the pursuit of cooperation and the mastery of the sunlight arts. The firstborn encouraged his followers to leave summon signs to aid others in their struggles, viewing mutual assistance in battle as the highest form of deific honor. He wanted a world where warriors were not isolated by their own strength, but united by their shared dedication to the light. This philosophy was a direct reflection of his own time on the front lines, where he realized that even a god could not win a war alone. The sunlight altar, found in the undead parish, and later in the high castle of Lothric, featured a massive statue of the firstborn holding his signature spear. Even after his name was erased and the statue was broken, the power of his covenant remained. Members of the Covenant, known as Sun Bros, would perform a final audit on their own combat skills by helping others defeat the most dangerous threats in the world. They were rewarded with sunlight medals, physical tokens of their service that carried the symbol of the sun of the firstborn. The Covenant was not a religion of submission, but a brotherhood of action. It was the only part of the Empire of Gwyn that focused on the empowerment of the individual through cooperation rather than control. The firstborn rewarded his most devout knights with the Great Lightning Spear miracle, a high-tier deific art that allowed humans to manifest the power of the sun. He taught them that the lightning was not a weapon of the gods alone, but a tool for anyone with the courage to wield it. This democratic approach to divine power was a source of concern for the other gods, who preferred to keep humanity in a state of dependence. The Warriors of Sunlight were the exception, a group of warriors who felt a direct and personal connection to the god of war. This bond is why the Covenant survived for eons, even as the statues of the firstborn were destroyed and his very name was forgotten. The reality of the Covenant is seen in characters like Solaire of Astora, a man whose entire life was defined by his pursuit of his own son. The dedication of Solaire is a direct legacy of the original vision of the firstborn. He believed that by helping others and perfecting his own sunlight arts, he could find the meaning that the world had lost. The Warriors of Sunlight are the requiem for the Age of Fire, the only group that stayed true to the original ideals of the gods, while everyone else fell into corruption and madness. The Nameless King, even in his exile at Archdragon Peak, continues to watch over his warriors, providing them with the strength they need to face the dark and the silence. The Warriors of Sunlight represent the only way to achieve a positive outcome in the terminal state of the world. By encouraging cooperation and mutual aid, the firstborn created a system that could resist the isolation and despair of the undead curse. He realized that the only way to save the world was to ensure that people didn't stop helping each other. This legacy is the reason the Sunlight Altar is always the most revered site for any warrior in the world of Lordran. It is a place of sanctuary and strength, a reminder that the god of war was not a tyrant, but a leader who wanted his soldiers to be as great as he was. The founding of the Covenant was the final act of a prince who knew the fire would eventually fade. The short and largely obscured era, known as the Reign of the Sun, God, represents the definitive period following the departure of Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder. When the First Lord left Anor Londo to perform the ultimate act of sacrifice by linking the First Flame, the Firstborn was the one who ascended to the throne as the primary authority. During this span of time, he was no longer merely a general or a god of war. He inherited the full sovereign titles of his father, becoming the king of the gods and the god of the sun. He donned the golden crown of Gwyn, which sat heavy with the responsibility of an entire world cycle. This was the pinnacle of his institutional power, a time when he was responsible for shepherding humanity and the remaining celestial beings toward a future defined by the light. During this brief monarchy, the Firstborn focused on the creation of proving grounds for the coming generations of champions. He understood that as the fire began to diminish, the biological and spiritual resilience of the world would naturally start to wane. To combat this slow decay, he is widely believed to have commissioned the construction of Sen's fortress. While many modern observers assume that Sen was a forgotten deity, the internal evidence within the architecture suggests that the fortress was the personal project of the Firstborn. He designed it as a lethal laboratory of traps and trials, intended to filter out the weak and ensure that only the most capable warriors could reach the city of the gods. It was a physical manifestation of his martial philosophy, a trial of grit for any human who sought to be a savior of the fire. The reign of the firstborn was characterized by a push toward martial excellence and the standardization of the miracle arts. He did not want a kingdom of passive worshippers. He wanted a kingdom of proactive warriors. He oversaw the finalization of the Sunlight Spear protocols and ensured that the Sunlight Covenant was integrated into the daily life of the city. He was a hands-on ruler, often seen walking the battlements of Anor Londo, rather than sitting in the silent seclusion of the throne room. This active approach to leadership made him a beloved figure among the Silver Knights, who viewed his brief era as a golden age of clarity. He provided the Celestials with a sense of purpose that had been missing since the conclusion of the war against the dragons. However, the weight of the crown also brought the firstborn into direct contact with the fundamental flaws of the Age of Fire. As the sun god, he was the one who had to manage the early signs of the undead curse and the initial fading of the light. He began to see the frantic efforts of the other gods to maintain their status, and he grew disillusioned with the cost of preserving his father's legacy. He realized that the fire was a hungry force that required constant sacrifice, and he began to question if the Age of Ancients had truly been the enemy. This was the period where he is said to have spent long hours in meditation, looking out over the clouds toward the ancient peaks where the dragons still resided. The king of the gods was beginning to feel the pull of a different path, one that did not involve the burning of souls for a dying sun. The administrative burden of Anor Londo started to conflict with his personal honor as a warrior. He was being asked to maintain a system built on illusions and the suppression of the dark, a task that felt inherently dishonest to a god who valued arms and nothing else. His reign was a time of immense outward glory, but inward rot. Every statue raised in his honor served as a reminder of the role he was expected to play, the dutiful son who would eventually follow his father into the flame. The firstborn, however, was not interested in being a martyr for a fraudulent system. He was a god of war who sought a worthy opponent and a true purpose, neither of which could be found on a stagnant throne. This era of his life was the final appraisal of his loyalty to his family, and the results of that internal survey would soon change the history of Lordran forever. As the long war with the dragons dragged on into its final centuries, the firstborn's perspective began to undergo a profound and irreversible shift. He had spent his entire life studying the creatures he hunted, learning their flight patterns, their elemental weaknesses, and the unique properties of their stone scales. Over time, this intense focus evolved from the cold scrutiny of a predator into a deep, begrudging respect for the immortality and strength of his prey. He began to see the dragons not as mindless monsters to be purged from the world, but as noble, primordial beings that represented the natural state of reality before his father's artificial Age of Fire began to impose its own rules. This transition was likely sparked by his combat encounters with the high-tier dragons that guarded the inner reaches of the Archtrees. Unlike the hollowed husks of the Silver Knights, the dragons possessed a sense of eternal calm and ancient wisdom that the gods lacked. They did not fear the dark, nor did they cling desperately to the light. They simply were. The firstborn, who had always valued honesty in battle, found himself increasingly attracted to the purity of the draconic existence. He began to question the deific narrative that the dragons were a threat to be eradicated. He started to view the dragon genocide as an act of massive environmental and spiritual theft, done a crime committed by the gods to secure their own comfort. The firstborn's philosophical shift was also influenced by his mastery of the storm. He realized that the lightning he wielded was a force of nature that existed long before the first flame. This elemental connection gave him a common ground with the dragons, who were the masters of the sky and the wind. He began to experiment with ways to communicate with the dragon kin, perhaps through the early serpent men, who served as the imperfect scouts of the ancient world. He sought to understand the path of the dragon, a form of meditation that allowed a being to transcend their physical form and tap into the primordial strength of the ancients. This study was a high-tier heresy in the eyes of the other gods, but for the firstborn, it was the only way to find the truth. He began to realize that the sun he was supposed to represent was a fading resource, whereas the dragons represented a permanence that the fire could never achieve. This appraisal of the two sides led him to a definitive conclusion. The gods were the intruders. By siding with the fire, he was siding with a flickering candle against the eternal starlight of the ancients. This realization was not an overnight change, but a slow, agonizing process of unlearning everything Gwyn had taught him. He looked at his Dragonslayer sword spear and saw a tool of murder rather than a tool of justice. He looked at his golden armor and saw a uniform of oppression. The god of war was becoming a student of the enemy, and his loyalty to Anor Londo was nearing its ultimate breaking point. His respect for the dragons eventually manifested in his refusal to continue the hunt. He began to sabotage the military operations of the Silver Knights, or at the very least, he stopped providing them with the tactical motivation they needed to succeed. He spent more time in the wilds, away from the city of the gods, seeking out the last remnants of the dragon kin. He was no longer looking for a fight. He was looking for a teacher. This shift in behavior did not go unnoticed by Gwyndolin or the other lords of Anor Londo, who began to whisper about the firstborn's treason of the heart. They could not understand how the architect of the Dragonslayers could turn his back on his own legacy. But for the Nameless King, the legacy of the dragon was the only one worth saving. The moment of the great betrayal stands as the most significant turning point in the annals of the gods. It was the day the firstborn finally acted upon his internal shift and formally allied himself with the dragons. This was not a military coup or a violent attempt to seize the throne of Anor Londo. It was a quiet, definitive rejection of the ideology of Gwyn. The firstborn essentially walked away from his godhood, his family, and his legacy to take the side of the creatures he had spent an age hunting. This act of treason was a high-stakes gamble that cost him his identity and his place in history. But it was a price he was willing to pay to achieve a state of spiritual honesty. The centerpiece of this betrayal was his bond with a storm drake, a creature known as the King of the Storm. He did not tame this creature through force or magic, but through a shared sense of camaraderie of the skies. They became companions in a way that defied the binary war between the gods and the ancients. By taming the drake, the firstborn was effectively merging the two greatest powers of the world, the sunlight lightning of his father and the primordial storm of the dragons. This partnership was the ultimate symbol of his defection. He was no longer a rider of the lightning. He was a brother to the storm. This bond was so powerful that it survived for eons, eventually manifesting in the final confrontation with the Ashen One at Archdragon Peak. The betrayal was seen as an unforgivable crime by the rest of the Pantheon. To the other gods, the firstborn had not just joined the enemy, he had betrayed the very essence of the sunlight. They viewed his actions as a form of biological and spiritual madness, a rejection of the order that kept the world from falling into the dark. Gwyn, who was already struggling with the fading of the fire, was said to be devastated by the treason of his eldest son. He viewed it as a personal failure of his own lineage, a rot that had started at the very top of the deific tree. The firstborn's departure left a void in the military structure of Anor Londo that could never be fully filled, even by heroes like Ornstein or Artorias. Following his defection, the firstborn became a target for the very knights he had once trained. He was forced to flee the city of the gods, taking his Stormdrake and his signature spear into the clouds. He was no longer a king, but a fugitive. This transition from a deific prince to an exiled heretic was the ultimate assessment of his conviction. He gave up the gold and the glory of Anor Londo for a life of isolation and wind. He did not seek to build a new empire or to conquer the world. He simply wanted a place where the dragons could live in peace, away from the prying eyes of the fire seekers. He became the protector of the ancients, a nameless guardian who watched over the remnants of a species that the gods had tried to erase. The great betrayal is the reason the Nameless King has no name. It was the catalyst for the Damnatio memoriae, the total erasure of his existence from the records of the world. By choosing the dragons over his father, he surrendered his right to be remembered. But in the eyes of the Nameless King, this was a small price to pay for the freedom he found in the sky. He had finally broken the cycle of the fire, even if only for himself and his draconic brothers. He was a god who had found his soul in the heart of the enemy, and his treason was the only way to save what was left of his honor. He was the first of the gods to realize that the Age of Fire was a lie, and his betrayal was the first act of truth in a world built on illusions. Furious at his son's ultimate betrayal, Lord Gwyn ordered a total and uncompromising erasure of the firstborn from the history of the gods. This was the Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was a systematic, administrative operation designed to remove every trace of the firstborn's existence from the public consciousness of Lordran. Gwyn did not just want his son gone, he wanted him to never have existed. The name of the firstborn was struck from all official texts. His statues were systematically smashed, and his deific status was officially revoked by a royal decree that carried the weight of divine law. He became a ghost, a nameless king, whose very identity was forbidden to be spoken of within the holy city of Anor Londo. The process of erasure was thorough and brutal. Every cathedral that featured a statue of the god of war was ordered to dismantle it. This is why, when the chosen undead explores the sunlight altar, or the ruined cathedrals of the undead parish, they find only broken pedestals or statues with their heads removed. The gods wanted to ensure that no future generation would ever find inspiration in the treason of the firstborn. They realized that the idea of a god choosing a dragon over the fire was a dangerous infection that could destabilize the entire religious structure of the kingdom. By erasing his name, they were performing a spiritual sterilization, ensuring that the legacy of the firstborn would rot in the silence of time. The Damnatio memoriae also extended to the miracles the firstborn had developed. While the Sunlight Covenant was allowed to continue, its origin was rewritten to credit Gwyn, or a generic god of war, whose name was lost to time. The specific miracle known as the Sunlight Blade was hidden away, eventually found only by those who could see through the illusions of Gwyndolin. The history of the Dragonslayers was carefully audited to remove any mention of their original architect. This caused a massive gap in the cultural memory of the Silver Knights, who continued to follow the martial protocols of a man they were no longer allowed to remember. They were soldiers fighting for a ghost, utilizing the techniques of a shadow. Despite the best efforts of Gwyn and Gwyndolin, the erasure was never 100% successful. Small pockets of memory remained in the distant lands like Ferossa, where the name Faraam became a sanctuary for the legend of the god of war. The warriors, who valued strength over sunlight, continued to worship the figure of a knight taming a dragon, unaware that they were honoring the exiled prince of Anor Londo. Even in Lordran, the presence of the broken statue served as a silent testimony to his existence. The void, where his name should have been, was a loud and persistent reminder of the god's failure to fully control the narrative of history. The Damnatio memoriae was a successful administrative act, but a failed psychological one. The Nameless King himself seemed to embrace this erasure. He did not attempt to reclaim his name or to broadcast his identity to the world. He accepted his status as a nameless exile, finding a new identity in his bond with the storm. He understood that by losing his name, he had gained his freedom from the expectations of the fire. The Damnarian memoriae was meant to be a punishment, but for the Nameless King, it was a release. He no longer had to be the sun god. He could simply be a warrior of the sky. The silence of Anor Londo was matched by the peace of Archdragon Peak, where the names of the gods meant nothing to the ancient dragons who lived there in eternal meditation. Following his official banishment and the total erasure of his name, the Nameless King sought a sanctuary that existed outside the jurisdiction of the fire. He found this refuge in Archdragon Peak, a hidden and sacred space located high above the clouds of Lothric. This was a place where the remnants of the dragonkin and the humans who sought to become them lived in a state of eternal meditation. Archdragon Peak was not just a geographic location. It was a sovereign pocket of reality, where the war between the gods and the ancients had effectively ended in a stalemate of peace. It was here that the Nameless King became the ultimate protector of the ancients, watching over the last wyverns and serpent men from his perch in the sky. The environment of Archdragon Peak is a stark contrast to the golden, sun-drenched halls of Anor Londo. It is a place of grey stone, ancient ruins, and a permanent atmospheric fog that mimics the conditions of the Age of Ancients. This setting was the perfect home for a god who had rejected the artificial light of the fire. Here, the Nameless King lived for aeons, his physical form beginning to undergo a slow and inevitable transition. As he lived among the clouds and the dragons, his skin became ashen and grey, and his hair began to bristle like the fibers of the storm. He was becoming a hollow god, a being who had outlived his own soul but remained held together by his immense will and his bond with the King of the Storm. The king's life at the peak was one of isolation and vigilance. He oversaw the path of the dragon cult, ensuring that the seekers who reached the summit were worthy of the draconic transformation. He did not rule over them like a king. He simply existed as their most powerful guardian. He was the one who blew the great bell that signaled the end of a seeker's journey, and he was the one who descended through the clouds to challenge any intruder who dared to disturb the peace of the ancients. He remained there for ages, watching the Age of Fire slowly rot and crumble beneath him. From his high-tier vantage point, he saw the rise and fall of countless kingdoms, Drangleic, Lothric, and others, each one repeating the same terminal mistakes of his father. The presence of the serpent men at Archdragon Peak provides a definitive link to the king's past. These creatures, often called imperfect dragons, were the same beings that populated Sen's fortress during the king's reign as the sun god. This suggests that the peak was always a part of his long-term plan, a sanctuary he had been preparing long before he officially declared his betrayal. He had built a secret network of draconic worship that spanned from the fortress to the clouds, creating a hidden culture that could survive the eventual collapse of Gwyn's world. Archdragon Peak was the ultimate middle finger to the fire-linking cycle, a place where the gods had no power and the truth of the ancients remained untainted. The exile of the Nameless King is a conclusive statement on his character. He chose a life of grey silence over a life of golden lies. He was the only god who successfully escaped the cycle of the fire without falling into the abyss or descending into madness. He simply stepped out of the story and into the fog. By the time the Ashen One reaches the peak in the final days of the world, the Nameless King is the last remaining shard of the original sunlight, a warrior who has stayed true to his own conviction for an entire age. His exile was not a punishment, it was a sanctuary. He was the Nameless King of the Storm, and he was finally truly free. In the rugged and distant kingdom of Faraam, a land forged by relentless mountain campaigns and a culture of feral warrior devotion, a specific legend persisted long after the gods of Anor Londo had faded into the mists of antiquity. This legend centered around a sovereign figure known as Faraam, the god of war. For eons, those who study the ancient scrolls have believed that Faraam was the secret identity adopted by the firstborn during his extensive wanderings following his exile. The warriors of Faraam did not bow to a deity of light or a lord of fire. They gave their loyalty to a god of raw strength and weapon mastery, who was often depicted in stone reliefs taming a massive dragon. This iconographic evidence provides a powerful link to the Nameless King, suggesting that even in his banishment, he continued to shape the martial spirit of human civilizations across the world. The Faraam Knights, the elite military order of Faraam, wore iconic, heavy armor that featured a detailed carving of a knight in combat with a winged serpent. This equipment was designed to honor a deity who valued the heat of battle and the mastery of arms above all other deific pursuits. The Knights of Faraam were famous for their intense aggression and their absolute refusal to retreat, a direct reflection of the martial philosophy the firstborn had pioneered during his time in the Age of Ancients. They believed that by channeling the spirit of Faraam, they could achieve a state of physical focus that made them nearly invincible on the field. This cultural memory of the god of war shows that while Gwyn may have successfully removed his son's name from the annals, he could not erase the impact of his soul on the hearts of men. The connection between Faraam and the firstborn is further reinforced by the presence of the Lion Knights within the Faraam military. As the original mentor to Ornstein, who wore the lion-themed golden armor of the four knights, the firstborn had always been associated with the symbol of the lion. By establishing a second legacy in Faraam under the name Faraam, he was continuing his work as a teacher of warriors. The Faraam Lion Knights utilized combat styles that emphasized heavy, staggering strikes and lightning-fast weapon transitions, mirroring the dual nature of the cross-shaped sword spear. Faraam became a secondary home for the king's ideology, a place where he could test the resilience of the human spirit without the interference of the laws of Anor Londo. Historical fragments found in the later lands of Dragonslayers suggest that Faraam was a mercenary god, a being who blessed those who sought victory through their own hands. rather than through deceptions or political maneuvers. This portrayal aligns perfectly with the Nameless King's rejection of the deific hierarchy. He had no interest in being a king of submissive worshippers. He wanted to be a god of soldiers who understood the weight of a blade. The name Faraam likely served as a protective shield, a pseudonym that allowed him to interact with the world of men without alerting the agents of Gwyn or the blades of the Darkmoon. He was the silent patron of the brave, a shadow that walked through the history of humanity, leaving behind a trail of broken blades and dragon-themed legends. The eventual disappearance of the kingdom of Ferossa into the mists of history mirrors the exile of the king himself. When the land fell to the ravages of war and the encroaching dark, the legend of Faraam did not vanish. It simply migrated into the hidden corners of the world. By the time of the era of Lothric, the armor of the Faraam knights was a rare relic, found only by the most dedicated seekers of the Dragonkin. The mystery of Faraam is the story of the king's middle years, a span of time where he proved that a warrior needs no name to be remembered. He was the god of war for a new generation, a sovereign of the sword who proved that even an exile can remain a legend in the hearts of those who value strength over the fading sunlight. In the concluding days of Anor Londo, as the illusions of Gwyn began to flicker, and the city of the gods became a tomb of golden memories, Dragonslayer Ornstein reached a definitive decision. For centuries, he had stood as the primary guardian of the cathedral, protecting a false princess and maintaining the facade of a royal house that had betrayed his master. However, many who ponder the lore posit that the discovery of a specific clue, perhaps a hidden record or a secret message left by the firstborn, ignited a new fire within the Lion Knight. Ornstein abandoned his sacred post, leaving behind the duty that had defined him for ages, and embarked on a journey across the crumbling world to find the mentor he had never truly forgotten. This departure was a total rejection of the deific order. Ornstein was the captain of the Four Knights, the most celebrated warrior in the history of the Fire. By leaving his post, he was signaling that the age of the gods was over. He traveled through the ruins of many kingdoms, following the path of the Dragonkin and the whispers of the storm. His search was not driven by a desire for revenge, but by a need for reconciliation. He sought to perform a final judgment of his own loyalty, to see if he could find a place in the new world the Nameless King had built in the clouds. He was a soldier seeking his general, a pupil seeking the truth behind the sun. The seeker eventually discovers the tragic and conclusive evidence of this journey at the gates of the Nameless King's arena at Archdragon Peak. There, discarded on the cold stone, lies the golden armor of the Dragonslayer and his legendary cross-spear. This placement is one of the most significant environmental clues in the history of the series. It suggests that Ornstein finally reached his destination and came face to face with the god of war. The absence of a corpse implies that Ornstein did not die in combat against his master, but rather he discarded his identity as a Knight of Gwyn to become something else. He surrendered the gold of the sun to embrace the ash of the dragon. Some lore observers suggest that Ornstein successfully transitioned into a draconic form, finally achieving the kinship with the ancients that his master had pioneered. Others believe that the king, seeing the loyalty of his first pupil, granted him a place in the sanctuary of the peak. Regardless of the specific outcome, the presence of his gear is a testament to the power of the bond between mentor and student. Ornstein proved that even after eons of silence and the total erasure of a name, The truth of a shared soul cannot be suppressed. He was the last knight of Anor Londo to seek the light of the true sun, a warrior who chose the exile of the king over the safety of the throne. The legacy of Ornstein's search is a requiem for the Age of Fire. It shows that even the most faithful servants of the fire eventually realized that the system was built on a lie. By finding the Nameless King, Ornstein was completing a cycle that began in the ancient training grounds of the gods thousands of years prior. He was no longer the captain of the four knights. He was a brother of the storm. The discarded armor is the final testament of his life's work, a symbol of a man who realized that the gold was a burden and the storm was freedom. He found his king, and in doing so, he found himself. Long before his formal exile and the treason of the heart, the firstborn served as the primary master of Sen's fortress, the legendary proving grounds that guarded the path to Anor Londo. While many assume that Sen was a lost deity of the fire, lore hunters and those who study the ancient stones have noted that the fortress is filled with serpent men, the imperfect dragons that serve the Nameless King at Archdragon Peak. This suggests that the fortress was not merely a defensive structure for the gods, but the king's personal sanctum and barracks. It was here that he first began his intense study of draconic kinship, observing the nature of the serpent men and developing the early rites for the path of the dragon. The architecture of the fortress is a reflection of the king's martial obsession. It is a place of lethal precision, filled with swinging blades, crushing boulders, and hidden traps designed to test the reflexes and the tactical bravery of any intruder. The firstborn viewed the fortress as a way to ensure that only the most resilient human warriors could ever set foot in the city of the gods. He had no interest in protecting the weak. He wanted to create an army of champions who were forged in the heat of battle. The presence of the serpent men as the primary guards of the facility suggests that even while serving Gwyn, the firstborn was already integrating the ancient dragonkin into his military structure. Sen's fortress also served as a place to keep the king's more controversial findings. Hidden behind its walls were relics of the ancient world that would have been considered heretical by the other lords of Anor Londo. The king utilized the fortress to house his collection of dragon-themed artifacts and his early drafts of the Sunlight Miracles. It was a place where he could operate away from the prying eyes of Gwyndolin and the gaze of the palace. The fortress was his territory, a sanctum within a sanctum where the god of war could explore the darker and more ancient truths of the world, without fear of immediate condemnation from his father. The Iron Golem, the massive guardian at the summit of the fortress, is another piece of evidence pointing toward the king's influence. The core of the golem is forged from a dragon bone, a material that was supposedly forbidden to the gods. By utilizing this material to create a guardian for the city, the firstborn was already blending the power of the ancients with the arts of the fire. He was testing the boundaries of what was possible, seeking to create a force that could survive the fading of the light. The golem was the ultimate test of a warrior's strength, a barrier that separated the mortal world from the gods. In the final era of the world, Sen's fortress stands as a ruined monument to the king's foresight. The serpent men still inhabit its halls, waiting for the return of their master or the arrival of a new champion. The fortress is the bridge between the old world of the gods and the new world of the dragons. It is the place where the Nameless King first realized that the strength of the ancients could be harnessed for a greater purpose. It was not a trap for humans. It was a school for those who would become like gods. The architecture of Sen's fortress is the record of a prince who was already becoming a king of the storm. Deep within the shifting walls and lethal machinery of Sen's fortress lies a secret that provides a look into the Nameless King's early descent. Hidden behind a deceptive wall lies the covetous gold serpent ring. In the traditional myths of the Age of Gods, serpents were considered failed dragons, beings that lacked the immortality and the stone scales of the ancients. To possess or honor such a creature was considered a borderline heresy for a deity of the sun. The fact that the firstborn hid this relic within his own stronghold implies that he was secretly harboring a profound sympathy for the dragonkin long before his formal betrayal. The serpent was a symbol of greed and the desire for more than what the gods had allotted to humanity. By keeping the serpent ring, the firstborn was acknowledging the hunger for truth and power that defined both the serpents and the humans who sought the dragon path. He recognized that the failed dragons were still closer to the truth than the gods who lived in the illusions of Anor Londo. This study of the serpent shows that the king's philosophical shift was not a sudden act of treason, but a slow and careful gathering of ancient truths. He was bringing together the pieces of a puzzle that would eventually lead him to the clouds of Archdragon Peak. The placement of the ring also serves as a clue for the wise. It is located in a position where only the most observant and dedicated explorers would ever find it. This was a test of perception, a way for the king to identify those who were willing to look beyond the obvious path provided by the gods. He wanted to find those who were hungry for the secrets of the ancients, the ones who would eventually become the seekers of the dragon path. The serpent ring was a lure, an invitation to join a secret philosophy that valued the primordial strength of the dragons over the flickering light of the first flame. Furthermore, the serpent symbol represents the king's realization that the gods were also failed in their own way. They were beings of the fire who were destined to fade, clinging to a legacy that was already nearing its end. The serpents, despite their flaws, were a part of the eternal world of the ancients. By embracing the serpent, the king was embracing the idea of permanence. He was rejecting the temporary glory of the sun for the everlasting grey of the arch trees. This was a rebellion of the mind that preceded the treason of the heart, a quiet rebellion that was conducted in the shadows of his own military fortress. The covetous gold serpent ring is more than just a piece of equipment. It is a historical record of a god's transition. It suggests that the Nameless King was never the obedient son that Gwyn wanted him to be. He was always an observer of the world's secrets, a man who sought to understand the hidden parts of history. The serpent ring is the physical proof of his early kinship with the ancients, a symbol that connects the House of Traps to the sanctuary of the clouds. It is the first clue in the mystery of the Nameless King, a sign that the god of war was always looking for a way back to the beginning. The character of Dragonslayer Ornstein serves as the ultimate study in the psychological impact of the Nameless King's exile. As the firstborn's most loyal pupil, Ornstein faced a moral and professional dilemma that spanned eons. When the king was banished and his name was erased from the scrolls, Ornstein was forced into a localized state of purposelessness. He was a captain without a commander, a knight of the sun who was serving a family that had destroyed his true master. For centuries, he maintained the facade of the Golden Knight of Anor Londo, guarding an empty cathedral and a false princess, all while harboring a secret loyalty that would eventually lead him away. Ornstein's loyalty was tested by the absolute silence of the gods regarding the firstborn. He was expected to participate in the erasure of memory, to act as if the man who taught him how to hold a spear had never existed. This decree of silence was a heavy weight for a warrior who valued honor and truth. Evidence suggests that Ornstein's decision to stay in Anor Londo for as long as he did was not a sign of loyalty to Gwyn, but a waiting game. He was waiting for a sign, a clue, or a moment where the illusions would break, allowing him to escape the city of the gods and seek out the true sun. He was a prisoner in a golden cage, his cross spear a constant reminder of the teacher he was forbidden to speak of. The internal judgment of Ornstein's loyalty is seen in his combat style. Even after thousands of years, he never adopted the heavier, slower movements of the other knights of Gwyn. He remained fast, agile, and reliant on the lightning thrusts he had learned from the god of war. He was maintaining the martial heritage of the Nameless King in the very heart of the palace that had disowned him. This was an act of quiet, persistent rebellion, a way for Ornstein to keep the memory of his master alive within his own body. Every strike he delivered was a tribute to the man who had been erased from history. When he finally abandoned his post, Ornstein was not just leaving a job, he was reclaiming his soul. The journey to Archdragon Peak was the ultimate test of his conviction. He had to navigate a world that had forgotten his master, fighting through the remnants of a dying age to reach the sanctuary in the clouds. The discovery of his armor at the gates of the Nameless King's arena is the resolution of his story. He chose the treason of his master over the duty of his father. He realized that a knight's true honor is not found in guarding a lie, but in following the truth to the end of the world. Ornstein's dilemma and its eventual resolution provide a requiem for the entire deific era. It proves that the institutional power of the gods could not break the personal bonds of the warriors who served them. Ornstein was the bridge between the glory of Anor Londo and the ash of the peak, the one who carried the legacy of the firstborn through the darkest centuries of the fire. His story is a statement on the power of mentorship and the resilience of the warrior spirit. He was the first knight of the sun and the last to find the truth in the heart of the storm. In the legendary warrior kingdom of Ferosa, a land defined by its relentless mountain campaigns and its devotion to the art of combat, the Nameless King found a second existence under the name of Faraam. This specific name became the centerpiece of a war cult that flourished long after the records of Anor Londo had been redacted. The people of Ferosa worshipped a sovereign known as the God of War, a deity who blessed their heavy armor and inspired their aggressive fighting style. This armor featured a detailed relief of a knight in a struggle with a dragon, a clear link to the firstborn's history. This era of the king's life served as a period where he led the famous Lion Knights through conflicts that shaped the world. The Lion Knights of Ferosa were the primary strength of this legacy, and their naming was a direct nod to the lion-themed heritage of Ornstein. By adopting the lion as their sigil, the warriors of Ferosa were unknowingly carrying the torch of a suppressed lineage. The king utilized this kingdom as a place for his martial theories, teaching the mortals of the region that the mastery of the weapon was the only true path in a world of decaying fire. The Faraam armor itself was a masterpiece of protective craftsmanship, designed to withstand the crushing blows of giants. It was a manifestation of the king's belief that a warrior should be a self-contained force, capable of enduring extreme conditions through force of will. The connection between Faraam and the firstborn is supported by the specific miracles found within the Ferosa region. The miracle, known as the Sacred Oath, which was used by the elite Lion Knights, spoke of a god of war who watched over his brothers-in-arms with a protective eye. This aligns with the Nameless King's persona as a general who fought alongside his men. In Ferossa, he was not a remote figure, but a legendary presence whose tactics were studied with fervor. He taught the knights how to utilize the weight of their swords to stagger their opponents and how to channel their internal strength. This was a school of combat that prioritized results over ritual, a sharp contrast to the traditions of the Sunlight Cathedrals. The fall of Ferossa is a chapter in this legend, as the kingdom was eventually consumed by war. However, the influence of Faraam did not perish. The survivors of the Lion Knights traveled across the world, spreading the stories of their god and ensuring that his martial philosophy remained a factor in the development of other warrior cultures. They carried the Faraam armor as a sacred relic, a symbol of a time when a god walked among men. This legacy is a record of the king's ability to reinvent himself, proving that even after the total erasure of his original name, his soul remained a force in the history of the world. In the final cycle of the fire, the Faraam armor remains a sought-after treasure for any seeker. It represents a link to a forgotten age of honor and raw power. The Nameless King's time as Faraam was his way of proving that the title of a god is irrelevant compared to the actions of the warrior. He did not need the gold of Enor Londo. He only needed a sword, a dragon, and a group of men brave enough to follow him into the storm. The Ferossa connection is the proof of the king's resilience, a testament to a being who could lose everything and still build a legacy that would outlast the fire. The Lion Knights of Ferossa represented the human manifestation of the Nameless King's martial ideology. These warriors were not traditional paladins. They were a highly disciplined order that functioned as the vanguard for the god of war. Their central tenet was the Sacred Oath, a miracle that allowed a group of soldiers to synchronize their spirits and share their physical resilience. This miracle mentions a god of war who watched over his brothers with a sense of communal honor, a portrayal that stands in opposition to the hierarchical nature of the other lords of Enor Londo. The king's philosophy was focused on the collective strength of the unit, a belief that the bond between warriors was a powerful force. The Sacred Oath was more than just a magical enhancement. It was a psychological anchor for the Lion Knights. It required a deep level of trust and respect between the participants, mirroring the camaraderie that the king felt for his Stormdrake and his first pupil. By utilizing this miracle, the knights were performing a test of their own loyalty to one another, creating a fighting force that was nearly impossible to break. They fought with a synchronized aggression that overwhelmed their enemies, utilizing the lightning-fast thrusts and heavy sweeps they had inherited from the God of War's own style. The Lion Knights were the physical record of the king's desire to create a cult of warriors who fought for each other. The king's stewardship of the Lion Knights was conducted through the dissemination of these miracles and the design of their equipment. He ensured that their armor was symbolic, featuring the lion to represent the strength of the sun and the dragon to represent the immortality of the ancients. This blending of themes was a statement on his own identity. He was teaching humanity that the true path lay in the synthesis of the old and the new. He wanted his knights to be the first of a new breed, beings who could transcend their mortal frames. The Lion Knights were his primary study for this spiritual evolution, a group of humans who were being prepared for a future that Gwyn could never have imagined. The legacy of the Sacred Oath survived long after the Lion Knights were scattered. Even in the final days of Lothric, the miracle remains a staple for those who follow the sunlight path. It serves as a silent reminder of the God of War's true legacy, a legacy of cooperation and the refusal to be isolated by fear. The Nameless King did not want a world of subjects. He wanted a world of brothers. He founded the Warriors of Sunlight and the Lion Knights to ensure that this spirit of cooperation would endure even after his own name was erased. The sacred oath is the song of his heart, a miracle that proves he was a god who valued the soul of the soldier. In the final reckoning of the Age of Fire, the Lion Knights stand as a requiem for a more honorable time. They were the ones who stayed true to the martial purity of the God of War, refusing to participate in the deceptions of other orders. They were the ones who understood that a warrior's worth is measured by the strength of the oath they keep. The Nameless King's influence on these men was definitive, a mark that could not be washed away by the passage of eons. The sacred oath is the song of the storm, a melody of brotherhood that continues to echo through the ruins, reminding all who hear it that the God of War is still watching over his brothers. The Taming of the Storm Drake, known as the Kings of the Storm, was the act that solidified the firstborn's transition from a god of the sun to a lord of the ancients. This was not a capture of a beast for utility. It was a profound bond of mutual respect. Ancient texts describe this relationship as a camaraderie of the skies, a term that implies equality and a shared soul that was unprecedented. By bonding with a storm drake, the king was effectively merging the greatest elemental powers, the sunlight lightning of his father and the primordial storm of the dragons. This was the act of treason against the fire, a total embrace of the enemy's nature. The storm drakes were powerful dragons, beings that commanded the winds and clouds. They were the natural rivals of the sunlight gods, and for an age, they were hunted with ferocity. The king's decision to tame one was a sign of his own shift. He realized that the dragons were not just targets, but potential allies who possessed a connection to the world the gods could never achieve. He spent centuries wandering the high peaks, seeking out a creature that was strong enough to challenge him and wise enough to understand his intent. The result was the King of the Storm, a companion who would stay by his side until the final moments. The taming process was likely a ritual of immense intensity. It was not a matter of breaking the creature's will, but of proving his own. The king had to demonstrate that he was not an interloper seeking to dominate the sky, but a warrior who respected the sovereignty of the storm. They fought through the clouds, trading lightning and wind until a state of absolute understanding was reached. This bond was sealed with a shared soul, a spiritual connection that allowed the king and the drake to move as a single organism. When they fly through the arena, they are a manifestation of a new order, one where the gods and the dragons are no longer at war. The presence of the storm drake allowed the Nameless King to reach heights that were inaccessible. He became the true master of the atmosphere, a lord who could strike from the heart of a hurricane. This aerial superiority was the primary reason he was able to establish his sanctuary and remain undetected. He was protected by the storm he had tamed, a barrier of wind that kept the fire seekers at bay. The King of the Storm was his shield and his wings, the partner in a life of exile. The relationship between the king and his drake is one of the most somber elements of his story. In the final battle, the king's reaction to the death of his companion is a testament to the depth of their bond. His hand visibly trembles as he prepares to absorb the drake's soul, a ritual of respect that ensures their strength will remain united even in death. This is not a power-up born of desperation, but a sacred draconic custom that honors the fallen. The taming of the Stormdrake was the moment the firstborn truly became the Nameless King, a being who had traded a crown for the heart of a dragon. Part 19. The Founding of Archdragon Peak. Archdragon Peak is not merely a location, it is a sanctuary that exists as a pocket, accessible only through a deep form of meditation known as the Path of the Dragon. The Nameless King established this peak as a sanctuary for those who wish to transcend their own limitations and find a state of peace with the ancients. It was his final rejection of the cycle of the fire, a place where the laws of Gwyn had no jurisdiction. Archdragon Peak was the place for the king's new world, a sanctuary where the serpent men, the wyverns, and the seekers of the dragon path could live in eternal meditation. The founding of the peak required the king to utilize his mastery of the storm to create a space that was shielded from the prying eyes of the fire-linking kingdoms. He utilized the primordial fog to cloak the mountain in a shroud, ensuring that only those who possessed true conviction could ever find the way. This was a great feat that required the king to effectively step out of the history of the world. He was no longer a player in the games of Anor Londo. He was the lord of his own reality, a king of a world that refused to burn. The culture of Archdragon Peak is one of silence and introspection. The seekers who reach the summit do not build cities. They sit in meditation, seeking to turn their flesh into stone. The king oversaw this process with detached wisdom, acting as the ultimate guardian. He was the one who blew the great bell, a ritual act that signaled the arrival of a champion. The peak was his monastery, a place where he could reflect on the eons of war he had witnessed, and finally find the peace that had eluded him. The architecture of the peak is a mixture of ruins and rock formations, reflecting the king's belief in the synthesis of the gods and the primordial. It is a place of grey stone and gold-flecked clouds, a visual representation of the king's dual nature. The presence of the great bell and the various dragon altars show that the king had established a new set of rituals, ones that focused on the achievement of draconic grace. He was teaching them that the true sun was not the one burning in the sky, but the one found in the heart of the storm. Archdragon Peak was the destination for all those who had grown weary of the lies of the gods. In the final days, Archdragon Peak remains the only place where the truth of the ancients is still preserved. It is a requiem for a world that was stolen by the fire, a sanctuary where the memory of the dragons is still honored. The Nameless King's founding of this place was his successful act of rebellion. He did not need to defeat Gwyn in battle. He simply needed to build a world that Gwyn could not touch. Archdragon Peak is the proof of the king's victory, a state of the soul that will remain long after the last cinder of the first flame has been extinguished. Part 20. The Mystery of the Sunlight Altar. In the ruined undead parish, and later within the high castle of Lothric, a broken statue of the firstborn stands as the centerpiece of the Sunlight Altar. This site is a focal point for the lore of the Nameless King, serving as a silent testimony to the greatness that was stolen. The statue is missing its head, yet it remains a place of spiritual power for the members of the Sunlight Covenant. Many believe that even after his exile, the king himself may have returned in secret to visit these sites of memory. He was a god who could not fully let go of the warriors he had founded, even as he embraced the path of the dragon. The Sunlight Altar is the place where the jolly cooperation is consecrated. Despite the fact that the god featured in the statue is nameless, his influence is felt in every miracle that is cast. The king's decision to leave the Sunlight Blade miracle on Gwyn's empty tomb in Anor Londo is often cited as evidence of his secret return. This was a final gesture of respect for the father who had disowned him, a tribute to their shared history. It shows that the Nameless King did not hate Gwyn. He simply could not live within the lie. The altar is the bridge between the king's past and his future, a place where the two identities meet. The mystery of the altar also involves the persistence of the sunlight medals. These physical tokens of service are given to those who help others in battle, carrying the symbol of the sun that the firstborn once represented. The fact that these medals continue to appear suggests that the king's power is still active in the world, even if it is no longer tied to a name. He is the silent patron of the warriors of the sun, providing them with the strength of the lightning even as he lives in exile. The altar is his way of maintaining a presence in the world of men, a way of ensuring that his martial philosophy is never fully extinguished. Furthermore, the sunlight altar represents the hope that the truth can survive even the most thorough erasure. Every time a seeker praises the sun at the altar, they are unknowingly honoring the Nameless King. They are acknowledging the spirit of cooperation and the mastery of arms that he pioneered. The broken statue is not a symbol of defeat, but a symbol of resilience. It proves that a name is just a word, but a legacy is a force of nature. The king's influence is woven into the fabric of the world's combat, a record of a greatness that refused to be forgotten. In the final reckoning, the sunlight altar stands as a requiem for the firstborn's heart. It is a place of sanctuary and strength, a testament to a god who wanted his soldiers to be better than he was. The Nameless King's connection to the altar is the proof of his soul, a soul that was large enough to encompass both the heat of the fire and the cool of the dragon's stone. He is the Nameless King of the sun, and his altar is the beacon for all those who seek to fight for more than just survival. It is the place where the war ends and the cooperation begins. Part 21. The Rivalry with the Darkmoon. While the firstborn was celebrated as the son of the sun, his younger brother Gwyn occupied a vastly different space within the celestial hierarchy as the son of the moon. This contrast in their very nature created a silent, eons-long rift between the two siblings that defined the internal soul of Anor Londo. Gwyn was raised in the cold shadows, associated with the moon and the feminine arts of sorcery and illusion, while the firstborn was the martial powerhouse who stood at the center of the blinding light. Many who study the ancient ruins believe that this rivalry was not one of open steel and blood, but of fundamentally opposing philosophies regarding the truth of the world. One brother chose to preserve a dying lie through the use of complex sorceries, while the other eventually chose to embrace a living enemy in the pursuit of a more honest reality. Gwyn's burden was to maintain the facade of Anor Londo's glory long after the other gods had fled or faded into the dark. He utilized his mastery of moon sorcery to create the illusion of a sun that never set, ensuring that the human city remained trapped in a state of artificial warmth. The firstborn, however, viewed such deceptions as a betrayal of the warrior spirit. To a god who valued the weight of a spear and the heat of true lightning, Gwyn's shadows were a form of cowardice. Lore seekers often suggest that the firstborn's departure was accelerated by his disgust with the path Gwyn had taken. He could not remain in a city where the light was merely a trick of the mind. Preferring the harsh winds and the grey reality of the dragonkin, over the comfortable fantasies of his brother. The Blades of the Darkmoon, the order founded by Gwyndolin to hunt down sinners and heretics, likely viewed the firstborn as the ultimate transgressor. In the eyes of the Moon followers, the firstborn's alliance with the dragons was a crime that threatened the very stability of the Age of Fire. While Gwyn ordered the physical removal of his son's name from the pillars of the city, it was likely Gwyndolin who oversaw the spiritual suppression of his memory. He transformed the god of war into a nameless traitor, a cautionary tale used to keep the remaining knights of the sun in line. This tension between the moon and the storm created a fractured legacy for the House of the Sun, with one son guarding a tomb and the other guarding a peak. The contrast between their respective covenants is also a source of great insight. The Warriors of Sunlight, founded by the firstborn, focused on cooperation and the empowerment of the individual through the trials of battle. The Blades of the Darkmoon, however, focused on retribution and the enforcement of the celestial law through the hunt. This ideological split represents the two paths available to the gods as the fire faded, one of shared strength and one of enforced order. The firstborn's choice to leave the city was a rejection of the Darkmoon's methods. He did not want to be a judge or a punisher. He wanted to be a comrade in arms. By choosing the dragons, he was choosing a path that Gwyndolin's moon magic could never reach. In the final reckoning, the rivalry between the brothers was a stalemate of convictions that lasted until the end of time. Gwyndolin perished trying to protect a memory of a world that no longer existed, eventually consumed by the gluttony of a saint. The Nameless King lived on as a withered shell, guarding a reality that the gods had tried to destroy. They were both victims of their father's legacy, but while Gwyndolin chose to drown in the shadows of the past, the firstborn chose to rise above the clouds into the truth of the storm. Their story is a requiem for a divided house, a family that was torn apart by the very fire they were meant to protect. Part 22. The Dragon Worship Cults of Lothric. By the final era of the world, specifically during the rise of the Kingdom of Lothric, the influence of the Nameless King had begun to seep back into the foundations of human society. While the official religion of the kingdom was centered on the duty of linking the fire, a hidden and highly influential movement had begun to honor the firstborn in secret. The High Priestess and the elite Knights of the Sun within Lothric's walls began to build hidden shrines to the god of war, realizing that the perpetual cycle of the fire was a burden that led only to stagnation and ash. This movement was not a public rebellion, but a quiet, internal shift toward the draconic path that the Nameless King had pioneered aeons prior. The presence of wyverns and the strange transformations of the flesh throughout the high walls of Lothric are often cited as signs of this draconic infiltration. The Knights of Lothric, who were once the primary protectors of the fire, began to seek ways to transcend their humanity and achieve the immortality of the Stone Ancients. They looked toward Archdragon Peak as a destination of hope rather than a site of heresy. This shift in the Lothric military suggests that the Nameless King's influence had successfully permeated the last bastion of Gwyn's lineage. The very knights who were intended to produce a Lord of Cinder were instead spending their hours in meditation, seeking the path of the dragon. The architecture of Lothric also reflects this secret devotion to the exiled prince. Hidden chambers and elevators led to forgotten areas where the symbol of the sun and the dragon were displayed together, mirroring the ancient icons of Ferosa. The Nameless King had become a figure of silent inspiration for those who had grown weary of the fire's hunger. He represented a way out of the cycle, a path toward a permanence that did not require the sacrifice of the soul. The tragic figures of the royalty within Lothric further demonstrate this obsession with draconic transformation, showing that even the highest reaches of the kingdom had fallen under the spell of the ancient ancients. This shift in belief was a definitive blow to the plans of the old gods. The Nameless King's legacy had outlived the institutions that tried to erase him from the world. He had become a god of the end times, a sovereign of the storm who offered a sanctuary for those who had been abandoned by the fire. The dragon worship cults of Lothric were the final manifestation of his martial philosophy, a proof that the truth of the ancients would always find a way to resurface even in the heart of a kingdom of fire. They were the ones who left the sacred gestures for the seekers to find, acting as the silent messengers of the king's sanctuary in the clouds. In the end, the kingdom of Lothric was a house divided between the duty to burn and the desire to fly. The Nameless King's influence was the catalyst for this internal conflict, a force that accelerated the collapse of the deific order. He did not need to lead an army to the gates of Lothric. He simply needed to exist as a symbol of defiance. By the time the world began to converge at the end of time, the cults of the dragon had proven that the god of war was the only deity who still mattered to the warriors of the world. He was the king of the storm, and his shadow was longer than the sunlight of his father. Part 23. The Physical Toll, the Ash Hollow State. When a seeker finally navigates the path of the dragon and arrives at the summit of Archdragon Peak, the being they encounter is a haunting shadow of the original god of war. Millennia of living in the thin, cold air above the clouds, away from the warmth of the fire, have taken a severe physical toll on the Nameless King. His flesh has turned to a dry, bristling grey ash, and his eyes have lost the golden glow of the sun. He has not linked the fire, so he has not been burned into a cinder. Instead, he has slowly withered into a state of ash and hollowed grace. He is a being who has outlived his own deific soul, held together only by his unbreakable will and his elemental bond with the king of the storm. This physical state is a visual record of the king's rejection of the celestial cycle. While the other gods clung to their beauty and their youth through the use of illusions or the consumption of humanity, the Nameless King allowed himself to age and decay naturally with the world. He embraced the hollowing of the world as a form of honesty. He is a hollow god, a term that many use to describe a deity who has discarded their divinity to become part of the primordial world once again. His appearance is a requiem for the age of fire, a physical demonstration of what happens when the light is allowed to fade completely. He does not look like a king of men. He looks like the stone of the mountain itself. Despite his withered appearance, the king's martial prowess remains at an incredible level. His movements are not those of a mindless creature, but of a master who has refined his techniques over countless eons of silence. He possesses a skeletal strength that defies his fragile appearance, swinging his massive sword spear with the same lethal precision he demonstrated in the Age of Ancients. This contrast between his decaying body and his absolute combat mastery is the ultimate testament to his character. He is a warrior who has sacrificed everything, his name, his beauty, and his standing, for the sake of his conviction. He is the ultimate survivor of the deific era, a man who refused to die until his purpose was fulfilled. The Ash Hollow State also represents the king's transition into a draconic being. His hair has become a mane of grey fibers that catch the lightning like the scales of a dragon, and his skin has taken on the texture of ancient stone. he is no longer a creature of the fire. He is a creature of the storm. This biological shift is the final stage of the path of the dragon, a state where the boundaries between the god and the ancient have been completely erased. He is the first of his kind, a hybrid of the sun and the stone, who represents a new way of existing in a world without fire. The sight of the Nameless King in his final state is a somber and definitive moment for any seeker. It proves that the path he chose was not one of glory or comfort, but of immense personal sacrifice. He is the king of nothing, a ruler of a grey peak who has outlived his entire family and the very city he was born to lead. Yet, in his ashen form, there is a dignity that the lords of Cinder lack. He is not a slave to the fire. He is a master of the wind. His physical toll is the price of his freedom, a record of a god who chose to become ash rather than continue to live a lie. Part 24. The Ritual of the Falling Drake. The confrontation with the Nameless King at Archdragon Peak is divided into two distinct acts, the transition between which provides one of the most emotional and lore-rich moments in the Chronicles of the Gods. During the first act, the king refuses to strike the Seeker personally, instead directing his Stormdrake to do the work. He acts as a commander, guiding his comrade through the clouds. However, when the Drake finally falls to the Seeker's blade, the king does not react with anger or a desire for revenge. Instead, he performs a sacred ritual that serves as a final testament to their bond. His hand visibly trembles as he approaches the fallen beast, a moment of profound grief that is rare in the history of the Celestials. The king plunges his sword spear into the neck of his fallen companion. But this is not an act of execution. It is a ritual of taking the strength of a fallen brother, an ancient draconic custom that ensures their spirits remain united for the final moments of the struggle. By absorbing the soul of the King of the Storm, the Nameless King is not acting out of greed. He is fulfilling an ancient oath of brotherhood. He is carrying the weight of his friend's life into the final battle, ensuring that the dragon's power is not wasted in the ash. This ritual is the ultimate manifestation of the camaraderie of the skies that defined their relationship. It is a somber statement on the nature of loyalty in a world of betrayal. This act also serves as a martial transition of immense power. As the king absorbs the dragon's soul, his sword spear becomes infused with the power of the primordial storm, allowing him to call down massive bolts of lightning and create devastating shockwaves. He becomes the true king of the storm, a being who possesses the combined strength of the sunlight gods and the ancient dragons. This is the moment where the Nameless King reveals his true potential, a potential that Gwyn likely feared when he first ordered the exile of his son. He is the only being in the world who has successfully unified the two opposing forces of the Age of Ancients and the Age of Fire. The trembling of the king's hand is the most important detail of the ritual. It shows that despite his ashen state and his eons of isolation, he still possesses a heart that can feel loss. He is not a mindless obstacle. He is a grieving warrior. This moment of humanity is what makes the Nameless King such a compelling figure. He is performing a duty that he never wanted to perform, putting an end to the life of his closest friend to ensure that their shared legacy can make one final stand. It is a requiem for a partnership that spanned ages, a bond that was stronger than the fire itself. In the final reckoning, the ritual of the falling drake is the moment the war truly ends. The last dragon and the last god become one, standing together against the seeker of the flame. It is a battle of two eras, the era of the cycle and the era of the storm. The king fights with a heavy intensity, his every strike a tribute to the fallen drake. He is no longer fighting for a throne or a name. He is fighting for the honor of a friend. This ritual is the final proof of the Nameless King's soul, proving that even at the end of the world, loyalty is the only thing that remains. The death of the Nameless King at the hands of the Seeker marks the true and final end of the lineage of Gwyn. By defeating him, the player is not just overcoming a difficult foe. They are extinguishing the last remaining shard of the original sunlight that once ruled the world. The king dies not as a villain or a tyrant, but as a warrior who stayed true to his own conviction for an entire age. He chose to die as a nameless ally of the dragons, rather than live as a king of a fraudulent and decaying empire. His passing is the final chapter in the story of the Age of Fire, a concluding statement on the failure of the gods to control the destiny of the world. Those who study the lore often reflect on the fact that the Nameless King is one of the few figures in the series who achieved a sense of personal peace before his end. He found his sanctuary, he found his comrade, and he found a purpose that was entirely his own. When he falls, he does not cry out in agony or curse the player. He simply fades into the wind, his body returning to the ash from which it was made. He has fulfilled his oath to the ancients and protected his sanctuary until the very end. His death is a requiem for a god who was too honest for his own world, a being who realized that the only way to be a true king was to give up the crown. The items received from his soul, the Dragonslayer sword spear and the storm-curved sword, carry the legacy of his dual nature. They are weapons of the sun and weapons of the storm, tools that represent the possibility of a world where the opposing forces of nature can exist in harmony. The Nameless King's death is the ultimate study of the warrior's path, proving that the value of a life is not measured by the names recorded in books, but by the strength of the bonds forged in the heat of battle. He leaves behind a legacy of cooperation and martial honor that will continue to inspire the warriors of the world long after the fire has finally gone out. The end of the God of War is also the end of the erasure of memory. By defeating him and claiming his soul, the Seeker has effectively rediscovered the truth that Gwyn tried so hard to hide. The name of the firstborn may still be lost, but his story is now part of the world's memory once again. He is no longer a ghost, he is a legend. The silence of Anor Londo has been replaced by the roar of the storm in the heart of the Seeker. The Nameless King's victory was not in surviving, but in remaining unchanged by a world that tried to destroy his identity. He was the first son, the last warrior, and the true king of the storm. As the fog clears over Archdragon Peak and the sun, the true cold sun of the end times, shines down on the arena, the world is left with a sense of somber finality. The war is over, the gods are gone, only the wind remains. The Nameless King's story is the story of the entire journey, a struggle against the fading of the light, a search for meaning in a hollow world, and the ultimate realization that the only thing worth fighting for is the truth of one's own soul. He was the god of war, and he fought his last battle with the same honor he possessed in the very beginning. Rest in the storm, Nameless King.